Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us again for another episode of Hypertrophy Past and Present. Coming up to the end of the year, and this must be, episode 35, something like that. So, Chris is looking shocked. Yeah, feels like just last week that we started, but it's been a big year, and thank you for you guys who've been with us since the beginning. So we decided that since it's the end of the year, we're going to do a bit of a topical episode today, and we're going to talk about kind of what people might be doing next week when they get into the gym. Maybe they've had a bit of time off. Obviously, a lot of people have had, different holidays and stuff at the moment where maybe they've fallen out of routine, and maybe some people are going to make some New Year's resolutions to actually, get into the gym for the first time next week. And so we're going to talk a little bit about maybe some ways to do it well, or at the very least, some mistakes to avoid when you do it. And some mistakes that we both have seen in the gyms that we're part of and with clients, and just what we've seen in the industry over the years. So that's going to be where this conversation is going to go. And look, to be honest, I don't know exactly where the conversation is going to go, and it's going to be a bit of fun. But we also want to follow it up next week with a part 2. And we're going to talk about, especially for you guys who are coaches or PTs, personal trainers, how you can effectively structure routines for clients next year, and you can deliver what clients maybe want or think that they want, but do so in an effective manner. Now, if that doesn't make sense to you, it will next week when we talk about it. But that's been something that has been a challenge for me over the years in finding a middle ground of what I know a client needs and what it is that they think that they need, or at least that they want. And so I'm excited for that conversation. Now, before we jump into today's conversation, obviously I've got a plan to talk about. But before I do all of that, I am not alone. I do have a co-host with me. Chris, how are you doing today?
I did start to think I was being forgotten. I'm just here to kind of wave at you and direct the conversation.
Facial expressions and thumbs up, and you're just my wingman.
I'm doing fine, thank you. Yes, very well.
Okay, great. So I've got a silver era plan to talk about today. One that we thought would contrast nicely to some of the mistakes we're about to talk about in a moment. So here we have, and this is coming from a magazine from 1952. So we've talked about anabolics recently. I think last week we talked about anabolics, and obviously we discussed it when they sort of were widely being used in bodybuilding was the early 60s. Anytime from sort of 1954 onwards, they were being experimented with. And so this was a routine that was published in a magazine in 1952. So presumably before anabolics were being used by sort of any bodybuilders in America. And this routine was what George Eiferman referred to as his favorite routine. So George Eiferman, obviously very, significant silver era bodybuilder. He won both Mr. Universe and also Mr. America competitions. He won Miss America in the late 40s, I think 48. And then he continued competing, actually for quite a long time. I think his Mr. Universe win was in the early 60s. So he was active in competing for, close to 2 decades. And the plan, like I said, is coming from 1952. So we can be fairly confident that this was a plan he was following when he was natural. There's no evidence that I'm aware of that he did in fact use any anabolics. But obviously, since he was competing in the 60s, it's hard to know that for sure. So we are back to a full body plan. Last week, obviously, with our golden era example, we had, what did we have? I think it was a 6-day-a-week plan. It was a weird split, wasn't it? I'm just remembering now. It was, I'm getting confused. Actually, we talked about Mike Mensa last week. You know what? For an enhanced plan, it was actually quite good. I reflected on that this week, actually, Chris. I didn't tell you about this, but I've actually been enthused to write a Mensa-inspired revamped plan. I know you're shaking your head at me, but as much as it may dismay us, not everyone will train full body. And so for those who won't, I want to provide the lesser of two evils, and I think a Mensa-inspired plan might get us there. Anyway, before I lose you completely, let me talk to you about this silver era full body plan. So George Eiferman, Chris is about to leave. I'm going to do this podcast solo, I have a feeling. So George Eiferman, we have full body 3 times per week, as was the usual. Obviously, almost every single silver era bodybuilder was doing that. Full body 3 times a week. That's just a norm. Don't listen to anyone who tries to tell you otherwise, because it's simply not true. And we had 3 sets per exercise. So every exercise was following the same structure, 3 sets, 7 to 10 repetitions, double progressive method. And we start with a hack squat. Now, when I say hack squat, I do not mean a machine. I mean a barbell hack squat. So if you haven't done this exercise, it's where generally you would have your heels elevated. You don't need to, but usually heels elevated, you have a barbell behind you. Imagine like a deadlift, but with the bar behind you instead of in front of you. So the bar is kind of following directly down behind your back and behind your legs, and you're squatting down with it. So starting with a hack squat, and then we go into a barbell bench press, then into a dumbbell fly, which they didn't call flies at that point. They called them bent arm laterals, but for all intents and purposes, it was a fly. And then a dumbbell lateral raise, a standing alternating dumbbell shoulder press. And this was done in the sagittal plane. So interesting exercise selection that I don't think we've seen a lot of in plans previously. And then we have a bent over one arm dumbbell row. Now, this was actually done in the transverse plane. So if you imagine bending over, dumbbell, we're not pulling up elbow kind of, close to our torso. We're actually pulling elbow directly out to the side. And then into a standing barbell curl, and then a dumbbell concentration curl, and then wrist curls. We didn't see a lot of wrist work. I mean, some of Hoffman's guys did do this, but here we have Eiferman doing a seated dumbbell wrist curl. Now, I believe he did high repetitions with this. I didn't have it noted down here, but I think from memory he did. And he did sort of talk about the purpose of this exercise was to make other exercises easier. So he thought it sort of made his grip more effective and easier to handle other weights. And then he went into dumbbell side bends. Now, with this, he was actually holding a weight overhead when he was doing the side bends, and then concluded with sit-ups. Now, that's 11 exercises in total. Obviously, we've got a couple of non-conventional exercises toward the end with the side bends and wrist exercise. But there we have, 33 sets in total, full body.
Wow. Yeah, that's some work. I don't think anybody's going to be surprised by my kind of complaints at this point. I mean, I'm just going to say the same things that I've said many times before. I mean, we were actually talking about that before we jumped on the podcast today. This doesn't seem to be very much hamstrings work in general across most of these programs. So, straight away, I'm not seeing any hamstrings work there. There's no, obviously there's no machines potentially available to do the kind of classic leg curl type exercise that we would want. But, even then there's no kind of deadlift variation in there. And, following on from that, there's very little, lat work. I mean, arguably there's no lat work in there because the row is out to the side. And there isn't even an isometric with the deadlift variation. So we're really, really struggling for lats. And I don't understand why that is. There's something weird going on. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if in, years' time, somebody goes, oh, well, didn't you know that all bodybuilders used to do pull-ups as part of their warm-up? They just didn't tell you. It's one of those things, it's like you can just imagine them kind of realizing, oh, we forgot to tell you we'd do
just
pull-ups.
Because everyone knew.
Yeah, everyone knew. It's like, but yeah, there's no kind of lat work in there, which is really disappointing. So yeah, hamstrings, lats, nothing there. And then as you mentioned to me when you were telling me about the program that we're going to do, there could have been some direct triceps work, and it's strange that there isn't direct triceps work in there, given that there is so much, direct biceps work. So again, some weirdness there. Having said that, I really like the way that we've got frontal plane and sagittal plane pressing. So you get that really nice kind of balance between the lateral and anterior delt.
And just by the by, I don't know if you have a mental image of what Eiferman looked like in your mind, but he had great developed chest and shoulders. And arms, were obviously not bad either. Biceps were quite well developed, but certainly I would say that the sort of high point of his physique was his chest and shoulders, which kind of checks out with his program.
Yeah, that's what this program is doing, I think. I think the sort of bench. I mean, to be honest, bench plus dumbbell fly for me would be a bit too much. But maybe he was a sort of an adult or a triceps dominant bencher. So, I mean, I'm not saying that is not possible to do 3 sets of bench followed by 3 sets of flies. If I could do that, because my chest is involved in a bench press, but I think it's probably not going to work for some people. Well, it's definitely not.
So your point with that, obviously, I assume you're referring more around like damage and volume, but in terms of exercise as well, what are those two, from a chest perspective, what are those two exercises doing differently or not doing differently, just so people are aware?
Well, it depends on how the bench is performed. It depends on who's doing the bench. If you've got someone who's a chest dominant bencher and you're in the definitively in the transverse plane, you're a wide grip bench, then really the kind of the regional activation will be almost identical between the dumbbell fly and the bench press. What you'll get is a little bit of a higher level of activation in the fly, simply because you're using a smaller amount of total muscle mass. So it allows you to recruit more motor units in the target muscles. But regionally, you'll be basically getting more or less the same output.
So if you're using a wide grip for the bench, effectively there's just not really any scenario where the bench is giving you anything for chest that the fly is not giving you.
Exactly. Whereas, obviously the bench is going to do other stuff as well, on top of that, especially with, the triceps. So that's why I always say it's like, it depends on your plane of motion. If you start to bring the bench press into a more sagittal plane range of motion, if you're tucking your kind of elbows and you're trying to make it more sagittal plane, you get obviously a different sort of focus. It becomes a much more clavicular exercise. You don't get any of the costal pec at all. So you kind of really change the way that the pec is working in that scenario. But again, a person who is not chest dominant at all, like I'm not, they're going to find that it becomes a very much a triceps exercise in that scenario. So the bench press, I think, is one of those scenarios where you have to just be a little bit aware that how you do the exercise and what type of, leverages you've got is going to start to move the effect of the exercise around a bit. I think the dumbbell fly is a little bit more kind of precise. Obviously a machine would be even better in that regard.
What's interesting with the bench in this situation, assuming he's using a wider grip, and it doesn't say close grip, so I'd imagine he is, then in fact, what would make this the most effective, what would give the bench the most efficacy possible would actually be if he was not chest dominant in his benching. Correct. Because if he was chest dominant, he's getting the same as the flyers, but less.
Exactly.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because someone would look at this and be like, I'm only going to use a bench if I'm chest dominant. Well, actually, that's going to give you the least return on investment in this situation.
Yeah, for me, this would work fine because there wouldn't be very much chest at all in that bench press. And there's no other triceps exercise. For me, that bench would be mostly a triceps exercise.
Yes, which is what you would want in this situation.
Which is what I would want in that situation. Yeah.
With the overhead, so the standing alternating dumbbell shoulder press done in the sagittal plane, is one likely to get much or any upper chest in this?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, that sagittal plane really does call the clavicular pec into the movement. And obviously the peak external momentum length is at 90 degrees, which is kind of where the clavicular pec is handing over to the anterior deltoid, if you kind of phrase it that way. So yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely getting some involvement there.
So just as we conclude with this, what do you think was done well here? What is good if we wanted to emulate this in a plan today?
Well, straight away, I think the delt work is definitely exemplary, and it's something that we have seen before in other programs of this nature. We don't tend to see so much today, because a lot of overhead pressing is done on machines, and those machines kind of tend to be scapular plane, really, and so they're kind of neither one thing nor the other. If they are in a plane, it's generally kind of frontal plane where they're sort of either side of the head. I actually get quite excited when I go in a gym and I see that there's a proper sagittal plane pressing possibility. It's kind of like, that's fun because I can start to make use of that. And when people use dumbbells to do their overhead pressing, they don't tend to do them in this way that we've seen described here. They almost always do them out to the side.
I very, very rarely see anyone do that. And if they do it, they're so weak that they don't want to do it because they feel like it must be inferior because how much less weight they're using. I've been using one of those.
I mean, that's a whole can of worms, really, right there. I mean, I think, yeah. the reason I was just
something you're not saying.
No, there's an issue there. The reason there's an issue there is because a lot of the time, I think we need to not. I think a lot of the time it's unhelpful to focus on the amount of weight that's being used in an exercise.
Oh, absolutely. My point is that people assume that the weight matters.
Yeah, but equally, there are other people running around thinking that if the exercise requires a small weight, that's also helpful. So they're trying to increase the moment arm. So like people are like, oh, well, if I do a lateral raise, I can only use this tiny dumbbell to do this exercise, and therefore it must be really. I'm like, no, hang on a minute. The instability you're creating there is causing the problem. So I think this is one of those things where the weight is almost irrelevant. It's like go back to basics and figure out why it is that the exercise is, kind of requiring a small weight. Is it because you're creating a gigantic lever and therefore it's probably quite unstable? Or is it because, the muscle that you're using is underdeveloped? And that's actually a good sign. It means that you've got a lot of capacity to improve, which is probably the case here. So it's almost, when I say the weight is relevant,
but it's also that you're using less muscle mass, right? Like you're not going to be using
you're using less. Yeah, exactly. So are there good reasons for using less weight, or are there bad reasons for using less weight? That was the thing that was making me chuckle. It was the fact that it's almost impossible to just kind of say, oh, the amount of weight I'm using is telling me something. No, it's not. It's the thing that comes before that determines why it is that you're using less weight. That's the interesting bit.
Yeah. On this exercise, I was going to say I've been using, I don't know if they're called, is it a Swiss bar? What do they call it? A football bar? I forget what they're called now, where it's a barbell that has like neutral grip handles. So I've been using like a close grip, neutral grip barbell essentially and doing sagittal overhead with that. I love it. It's so good. I wish I'd been doing this sooner. It's such a great exercise.
Yeah, I don't see those bars very often actually in the gyms that I've frequented, but I know what you mean. I've seen them in the past, but I think they've fallen slightly out of favor. But no, that's a really interesting possibility. So yeah, in terms of stuff that's good, I think the delt work definitely jumps out at me. I can't say very much else positive, I don't think. I really don't.
The format is obviously good.
I mean, yeah, sure. 3 times a week and 3 sets. And did you mention that it's 7 to 10 reps?
7 to 10, yeah, I think I did say that.
Which is a nice rep range. I mean, what I would describe as moderately heavy in that sort of lower half of the moderate rep range, which is great. It's generally requires very little warm up to do. You can kind of jump from one exercise to the other. But he's doing 3 sets. I mean, he's doing a lot of work. I mean, total workload I think is toppy.
Yes.
But some of that exercise selection is fluff. I mean, some of it's tough. I mean, he's got squats and bench in there. I mean, that's a lot. But a lot of the others, I mean, concentration curls, wrist curls, side bends, sit-ups. I mean, come on. I mean,
from exercise 8 onwards, it's a bit fluff, right? So 1 to 7. So we got 21 sets of good quality work in there. Some of it's not going to be that demanding.
Honestly,
raise.
Bent over row in the transverse plane, I'm not a fan of either. I mean,
so I haven't been doing that exercise, but I've been doing a single arm, like a cable, single arm row in the transverse plane. And that feels, the way I've been doing it is you can actually stabilize yourself, like wedge yourself into the cable setup. So I'm fully sandwiched in it. I couldn't be more stable if I tried, and doing it like that. And I've been finding that a really nice feeling exercise.
Interesting.
You mean disapprovingly?
No, not disapprovingly, skeptically. That's my master.
I'll film it and post it, and you can see what you think of it.
I think every time I've tried to do rows in the transverse plane, I've kind of just caught myself thinking, why am I not just doing a rear delt fly at this point? especially when I try and do anything single arm. I'm like, just why am I not just doing rear delt fly? Because that would be so much more kind of, appropriate for what I'm trying to achieve. As soon as I start bringing in kind of biceps movement, elbow movement, I'm like, what am I adding here? What's the purpose of this? What's it doing?
I guess it'd be if you were trying to get some trap in there as well.
I think you're trolling me at this point. I mean, some trap. I mean, okay, some fibers of the traps, yeah, sure. But again, are we getting very?
There's not a lot of trap work in this. I mean, this is not that exercise is doing a lot of heavy lifting in this routine. It's giving us all the back development.
It's horrid. It's really horrid.
Because we don't even have a deadlift.
Well, yeah. So, but this is one of those situations where, for people who may be coming to this episode, cold and going, why are these guys describing this routine and hating on it when they're supposed to be kind of promoting silver era routines? It's because we've done all of the good ones.
Hey, I've got some good ones up my sleeve. It just so happens to be people we've talked about in the past, and you'd be like, oh my God, here we go again. 6th plan for Edge Park or whatever else.
We've covered some really, really good silver era routines. We're kind of like now starting to cover stuff that's, a little bit fringe compared to the stuff that we've done before. Yes, there's some really, really big issues with this particular program, but fundamentally it's still, as you said, 3 times a week. We're still looking at, kind of 3 sets, as the kind of top end volume, moderately heavy reps. There's a lot of stuff, full body. It's a lot of stuff that is fundamental about this routine that we've covered before. We're just kind of arguing about exercise selection. I'm being really fussy about back exercises because it's my thing. So ultimately, for me, it's horrid. It really is. Like single arm dumbbell, kind of transverse plane row. It's like you couldn't have made up a routine that I would hate more. As far as the back is concerned, anyway.
As far as exercise selection goes.
As far as exercise selection goes, for the back, yes. I mean,
everything that he's doing is going to get well developed because it's good frequency, it's good volume, and he's not changing the exercises. So it's a hell of a lot better than most of what we see.
Absolutely. And that's the point, isn't it? It's like even when these guys are making exercise selection errors, they're still getting, pretty much everything else right. And that's the point. That's the whole point of this, kind of focus on this era of time, because they knew how to do things, structurally correctly.
And you know what? If you do that, if you're getting everything else right and you've stuffed up exercise selection, the fact that you're getting everything else right means soon enough you're going to see what you're doing wrong. Because everything is getting developed that you're training at the moment.
You'll kind of look in the mirror and go, why is that not working? Everything else is fine. And then you'll fix it. To be fair, I've had that argument has been made to me a number of times by people over the years. It's like, why should I kind of listen to you about exercise selection when I can just do this, routine? Then I'll see what I'm missing and then I'll fix it by adding the right exercises in. I'm like, if the rest of your routine is good and you've
as long as the bones are good,
then you will notice that. But if you're doing a whole bunch of silly stuff in your routine and you're kind of making a lot of other mistakes, then no, you won't notice that.
Because nothing's going to work. And perhaps we should use that as a segue to talk about some of this silly stuff. So, and this is not us throwing shade on people who are joining the gym next week. I see a lot of that happening online. There's no need to do that. No need to spread hate for people who are joining the gym for the first time in January. Obviously, that's something we want to encourage, but there are a lot of pitfalls and mistakes that people are likely to walk into. So we want to identify some of those mistakes now, and hopefully we'll avoid some people making them.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were talking about this, sort of going through a list of possible things before we jumped on the podcast, and I've got a list here that I've written down. There isn't, or when we were talking about it, you started analysing out to categories, which I've kind of resisted a little bit because I think some of them blur the edges of those categories, and so I start to lose the entirety of what I want to kind of get into the episode. But basically, this was inspired by the fact that I've already started to see personal trainers in the gyms that I go to starting to bring in new clients around this time. I think they're getting ahead of the January rush, and they're starting to do routines with those new clients. And I'm looking at them and I'm kind of taking notes of the things that they're doing that I think are less effective than, what we'll probably talk about next week, which will be a really good approach. And, part of that is probably because the client is expecting a certain type of thing. And part of it is possibly because those, personal trainers maybe are getting information from other sources. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. The thing is that there are these things that I'm seeing that I think are probably not very effective. And for me at the moment still, and this could just be regional. It doesn't have to be that everyone in the world is experiencing the same trend, but I'm seeing this persistent tendency for people to program unstable exercises. And stability is a continuum. So this is like, from one end of the spectrum to the other. So like if you imagine maybe kind of 10, 20 years ago, there was a fad and people were taking instability to the absolute maximum level. They were kind of doing exercises balancing on, kind of wobble boards and sort of Bosu balls and stability balls and Swiss balls and, any other unstable structure you can think of. People were doing exercises on those things, and it was requiring tiny amounts of tiny amounts of weight, enormous amounts of focus and concentration on balancing rather than actually producing effort towards motor unit recruitment. And so you end up with an exercise that is very good at teaching you how to balance and simultaneously very, very bad at producing high levels of recruitment in the muscles that you're actually trying to train. I'm not seeing that level of instability, but I'm seeing something almost there. So I'm seeing a lot of exercises where people are using cable stations. Yeah. And then standing, a long way away from that cable station with no means of support other than the floor. And they're trying to do an exercise that involves them using the floor as their only point of support. And then they're moving the cable in some particular direction. It might be kind of a lat sort of straight arm pull down. It might be something with the rear delt out to the side. It doesn't really matter what it is. It could even be a triceps extension. It doesn't matter what it is. The point is that their only point of support is the floor, and they're trying to arrange their body in space to avoid themselves falling over to one side, the other, or forwards or backwards while they're doing the exercise in question. Of course, what that means is they end up using a much smaller load than they would be able to if they were supporting themselves by holding on to the machine in question. So for me, that's the thing I'm seeing most at the moment. I think is really, really unhelpful because, of course, what it means is you end up spreading your activation from the brain across the entire body to try and stabilize yourself, and you end up using a much lower level of recruitment in the target muscle that you're trying to train. It's so much better to either do the exercise similarly using a point of support or multiple points of support, or even better to just go and use a machine that kind of gives you all of that support automatically, rather than messing around with the cables.
Yeah. One encouragement I would make to people on this is don't be scared to perform an exercise in a slightly variant way that makes it more effective for you or more stable in this situation. And this is something that, honestly, I've only learned over the last few years. I would think, I have to do an exercise the way that exercise is meant to be done. And there might be little tweaks one can make, especially if you're using a cable station where you might, for example, pull to the other end of the station. So then you can wrap your arm around one of those columns and you can stabilize yourself like that. Or it might be that if you're, doing like a seated cable exercise, perhaps you have one leg on the floor instead of both legs on the pads. And you might find that some of these little tweaks, while looking unconventional, will enhance your stability significantly. And then all you need to do is just make a mental log. Okay, this is the way I perform that exercise. And when I log my weight, I'm logging it for this version of that exercise. It doesn't matter that it's slightly different how someone else is performing it. I would really encourage people to play around and find ways they can do that. I use cable stations quite a lot, but I know for me, if I were to do a single arm behind the back standing cable curl, and so if I'm standing so that the cable's behind me, I'm standing, I'm doing that, compared to I just move a little bit more forwards to the other end of the cable station and wrap my other arm around that beam and I do it like that, I'm going to lift almost twice as much load doing it like that. Simple tweak. I might look stupid doing it.
Here is an example of going back to the point we raised earlier. Here's an example of where the amount of weight actually is an interesting piece of information.
Yes.
So yeah, absolutely. I mean, but equally, you've got to kind of be aware, have I just increased the load because I've changed the external levers? So cable stations can be really annoying in that respect, because if you start moving your body in space around relative to the machine, you are absolutely going to change the levers. So you have to be aware that, if an exercise...
So you need to look at the angle of the cable coming towards your body. Yeah, so that's how people can see what's shifting here.
Yeah.
Is the cable further away, closer to my body? Am I gripping it further, closer away from my body?
So that's an issue there. But equally, if nothing is changing about the actual pattern, the movement in space, but the exercise becomes suddenly a lot easier, and it's potentially because you just increased the support availabilities, then that is absolutely going to be an increase in recruitment of the target muscle that's done that. So there's a little bit of navigation to be done there. But in the context of keeping the movement pattern the same, if you suddenly discover that the exercise has apparently got easier and you've had to load more weight by some additional tweak that you've made, then that probably is a positive one. But as I say, it just comes back to this things like changes in load aren't automatically good or bad. It's like they just are. They're information, but you've got to kind of go down a level to figure out what is going on.
Yes, exactly. A classic example here would be using a cuff instead of a handle for a cable lateral raise. And then suddenly you're lifting more load with the cuff.
Yeah, but have you just...
you changed the lever length. Yeah. Yeah, so it's not always easy to just look at the load and think that that's telling you something.
It's information, but you've kind of got to take a big kind of Sherlock Holmes-sized leap to try and figure out what it is that's actually created that effect. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. It's not simple information at all.
Now, the final point I want to make on how one can tweak this scenario to work better for them is, if it were me in these cable station scenarios, I would be using a lot more single limb work. So generally, and usually that's just to limit the load, right? But if you're using a heavier load, like you've identified it's pulling you all over the place, you're having to like counter that load from pulling you up off the floor, whatever it might be. It's, imagine triceps, if you're doing like a triceps press down with a cable and you're using bilateral. I mean, a lot of people, if you're even remotely strong, you're either going to have to do 30 repetitions or it's going to be pulling you up every single repetition. So suddenly if you go to unilateral, then, you're using almost half the load and it's going to be a lot more stable.
Totally. And on that point, obviously there's another positive and another negative. The other positive is you've now got a free limb that you can use to stabilize yourself, which is a huge positive. A negative is that if you're actually strong, then you will rotate. So this is an issue that those of us who kind of done a lot of one-arm pull-up type work would have discovered, that you instantly just rotate into the direction that you're pulling. So there's kind of a positive and a negative there. But as I say, if you've got the other arm to stabilize yourself, then that shouldn't happen anyway. So I think on balance, I would definitely go down the route of single arm stuff in that scenario. But primarily because I can then use the other arm as support. I think that's why I would do that.
Yeah. Anything else to be said on stability, or does that about cover it? I mean, it's a fairly basic concept. Don't do unstable exercises for the sake of being unstable.
Again, it's like, kind of, we were joking before we got on the podcast today, and I was like, how many times can I just say this? It's like, you've got a whole gym full of this wonderful equipment that's been specifically designed to give you more stability. Please go and use it. It's like, don't have to kind of create. I think it's this is something I think we'll dwell on next week to a certain extent, because there's this perception that if an exercise looks kind of complicated and requires this difficulty in the balance, sort of realm, if you like, that suddenly it's doing something really interesting and technical and exciting, and therefore it's more attractive and it's, kind of more interesting to the client. I think that's something we'll probably have to kind of dwell on next week. But ultimately, if we can avoid doing that, I think it's better, because those balance requirements are going in the opposite direction from what we want to do, which is create, a high level of motor unit recruitment in the target muscles.
And if someone's listening to this and they're thinking, but hang on, I want to work stabilizers, or I want to work my balance, want to work whatever it is you want to work, okay, do one of those exercises at the end or at the start of your workout. Don't do it as a hypertrophy exercise. Do not try to achieve both things with that one exercise.
To which I would also add that balance is extremely specific to, unless you're a kid. I mean, they learn balance and it's a separate issue. But sort of in the context of adults going to the gym, which is our remit, balance is very specific to the exercise that you're training. You can't learn to balance in one exercise and expect that that's going to transfer
cross over to something other.
Balance in some other scenario. You're not going to be, suddenly some kind of, superhero being able to balance on all kinds of weird things. It's very specific. So if you've got a particular skill, calisthenics skill that you're learning, then practice that either separately or at the beginning of the workout.
Exactly.
You get better at it. That's not the same thing as, making a strength training exercise have a bigger balance requirement and expecting that to transfer to something, because it's not going to.
Okay, what is our next listed mistake?
So I've put these in order of things that offend me. So
I was literally going to say, did you just put an order of how much they annoy you when you see them?
This is in order of how much they offend me. Yeah. So this second one is probably a contender for the first position. I'm just kind of, at the moment, I'm not seeing it quite so much. I'm seeing the instability stuff more, but absolutely, this is a primary offender. It's the cardiovascular sensations kind of thing. So essentially, what I'm seeing is that when personal trainers are trying to, deliver value to their clients, they tend to just try to make them get out of breath. And that's the opposite of what we want to do. So, I see them using a lot of high repetition work, a lot of short rest periods, and generally, kind of large muscle mass involved in the exercise selection. So, sort of large kind of squat and deadlift type variations, big sort of lateral pull down rows, which, are great. I mean, I do them all the time, but they're kind of building routines around full body kind of multi-joint exercises, which again, there's nothing wrong with that, but when you combine it with short rests and high repetitions, you're basically just getting people out of breath, and they're going to find that therefore they get nowhere near to high levels of motor unit recruitment in the exercise that they're doing. And again, combine that with the previous one where the exercises are generally unstable and you're a million miles away from high levels of motor unit recruitment. So it kind of really just becomes, like you would say, weighted cardio.
And it blurs into the first point anyway, in that, hey, if you're trying to achieve a goal with this, like if you're thinking, oh, well, I'm doing this to kill two birds with one stone, and I'm getting some cardiovascular work in by doing this as well, okay, then do the cardiovascular work, but make it more effective and do it actually separately, and either, do it at the end of the workout on a separate day.
I think you're kind of mildly bruising two birds with one stone. This is any killing going on.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, precisely. And yeah, to the extent that you're going to do one of them, as soon as you lean into doing one of them adequately, the other one is going to be done very poorly.
Exactly. Yeah, there's not really a zone where you can get both the best of both worlds. You can't even really get, as you just said, anything approximating a satisfactory result on either two worlds simultaneously. It's really, you kind of just go as far as you can in one direction and then as far as you can in the opposite direction. And really, for me, if people are doing cardio at loss, I would just bring the intensity right the way down to something that's very, very, very kind of, sort of low, something that's much more agreeable, something that's not kind of going into this sensation, disagreeable sensation territory. So I think really, so treadmill walking, for me, I prefer the cross trainer. I think the impact phase is not great about treadmills. So, cross trainer, especially if you've got the arms working at the same time, you can really bring down the activation of each muscle group that's working, keeping the cardiovascular system ticking over nicely. And you can do that and just kind of, or go outside and go for a walk. Yeah. Whereas, in the gym, we kind of want to be trying to minimize disagreeable sensations that don't come from the motor unit recruitment signal. I want to make sure we get as high recruitment as possible. So that would be, for me, the thing that I see, as the second, but again, possibly tying for first.
With the cardiovascular stuff, I mean, don't underestimate, the ability or the benefit of, like you said, going for a walk or doing some kind of, sport or some outdoor activity. I mean, I love using that stuff with clients because a lot of it is learning a skill. Like you're actually getting additional bang for buck beyond just the cardiovascular benefits. What do you think of something I use a little bit with clients especially clients who want to be in the gym, You know, those clients who are like, yeah, I want 6 days a week. Sometimes I'll give those clients a modified strongman on 2 of those days where they feel like they're doing weights, but we're not using the eccentric parts of that lift and we're using it more for conditioning, obviously knowing we're not going to be getting much or any hypertrophy benefit out of that. Do you have any feelings around strongman type exercises?
So I think they definitely do kind of fall into a couple of categories there. So there's the category that is definitively, concentric only, like sled pushers.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's really interesting because you definitely are going in the territory of creating a really nice cardiovascular challenge, which, is something that you may wish to obtain. But, you're not creating a lot of eccentric induced muscle damage, which is, important when you're talking about cardio. So, and if that is fun and enjoyable and you can get a couple of people doing it and, kind of competitive environment and, and it's meeting another set of goals, fantastic. I think there's the other kind of category which I would look at with strongman, which is stuff that, you don't really want to be doing unless you're going to compete in strongman.
Yes.
I mean, there's a couple of bits and pieces in there that I think are interesting for maybe the grappling sports, but mostly there's a bunch of stuff in there that I think it's like, there's a relatively high risk of injury in some of that stuff, and there's a bunch of eccentric loading. So I'm just like, what am I even talking about this for? Unless the guy is going to be competing in strongman, I'm just not interested in programming any of that stuff. But so I think for me, it really does fall into 2 categories. There's some really interesting concentric only stuff that's great for conditioning, if that's a goal. And there's some stuff that I would really just kind of be like, no, this is uniquely for, athletes competing in specific sports.
Yep. Yeah, that checks out. So someone to avoid the cardiovascular demand of the exercise they're doing for hypertrophy benefit, ultimately that's going to come mostly down to rest periods. Actually, that's a point I wanted to make on that topic.
Ranges and rest periods, yeah.
Yes. Now, what if someone thinks, oh, hang on, I've only got half an hour though, so therefore I need to do short rest periods. I need to do 40-second rest periods so I can do my 2 to 3 sets of each exercise and get my full body session down because you keep telling me full body is the only way to go. And that means that I'm going to be having my heart rate isn't going to be coming down the whole workout. What do they do?
So straight away, in that pen portrait that you just sketched for me, the error that person is making is assuming that they need to volume max instead of frequency max.
Yeah.
So they're going, I need 3 sets. I'm like, no, you don't.
Yeah.
You need
to do 1 set. You do quality. And
much better to do the 3 times a week than to get the 3 sets in the one workout. So, so straight away I'd be like, no, you need to carve your workout down to a smaller amount of stuff, or you need to do some very clever strategic stuff around clusters and, reps in reserve and
which we might talk about next week, perhaps.
We can do next week. But ultimately, it's like straight away you look at the pen portrait and go, what assumptions are being made here that are not correct? And for me, straight away, the volume one is the one that's not correct.
Because in that scenario, what's interesting is, okay, you're getting more volume of work done, but each one of those sets is less effective than if you just did single sets.
And let me just very briefly kind of go off on a rabbit hole here, which has been a topic that other people have been making comments about recently correctly, which is that there is a difference between the rate of progress and how far you can go. Mm-hmm. So rate of progress obviously is what it sounds like. It's like how fast are you moving forwards in terms of growing muscle mass, but how far you can go is a separate question. If you're constantly doing exercises every time you go in the gym with a high level of effort perception related to cardiovascular sensations, you are basically lowering your final kind of sort of end point. You're making
how far you can go.
Yeah, you're stopping yourself getting to a maximum level of muscle mass because you are never, ever, ever, ever going to recruit the highest motor units in the muscles that you're training. You just can't do that. So ultimately, I think that's a really important point, which is that if you set up your routine to do that routinely, as in all the time, you're never going to reach the same level of development as somebody who, kind of maybe takes a slower route, does smaller amounts of volume each workout, but gives themselves the rest period in order to achieve higher recruitment in each set that they do.
Yeah, that's an important distinction. So you may actually progress more quicker if you're doing the multi-sets, but only for a very limited amount of time.
Potentially, yeah. I mean, it's hard to say. But yeah, they may find that they, especially with muscle swelling being a factor, but at the end of the day, they might see slightly faster progress to begin with, but it will, ultimately not go as far.
That was another thing I was inspired to do this past week, post talking about Mensa, was I went back to single sets this week just because I've been too busy. It was simply, I don't have time to get this stuff done. I'm doing one set per exercise. It was amazing. It was done in like 15, 20 minutes. But each one of those sets, I'll tell you what, I was adding 1 or 2 repetitions.
PBs, yeah. I every single time without fail, like, and you really kind of start to go, if I'm adding stimulating reps up and trying to calculate the stimulating rep number for each, I mean, again, there's a diminishing returns, but the point is that even if you just go off stimulating reps, you start calculating the number of stimulating reps, you realize that in 3-set protocols, you first set may be around 3 or 4 rather than 5. And then you kind of like, well, and how much am I losing due to fatigue? And you kind of add up what you thought was 15 stimulating reps is probably close to 11 or 12. Yeah. And then you do that. So maybe now you can see why 3 sets is more like, double the hypertrophy of 2 sets or even less. But sorry, double the hypertrophy of 1 set or even less.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And a simple hack is just do 2 different exercises, 1 set of each for the same muscle. If you're like, you know what, I really want to volumize it, okay, go for gold, but still do single sets and see how well you perform.
Better to use more exercises rather than more sets of the same exercise. I mean, that is absolutely true. And just kind of flowing into the third item on my list with that observation, which is, very similar, which is that what I see a lot of the personal trainers doing in the gyms that I go to is varying the exercises either over the week or just kind of changing them completely.
Making it up each session. We're going to do this exercise today.
Different. So either it's like they're kind of switching exercises from session to session, which means that you're not training the same exact muscle fibers, or they're just completely changing them and just sort of doing like, completely new stuff. And technically it hits the muscle, and that's probably one of the statements that's done the worst damage to the fitness industry in kind of like modern era. The idea that you can train a muscle, it's like that statement is wrong. You cannot train a muscle. We're training muscle fibers, or if you want to be really specific, and technical motor units. There's no way that you can train a muscle. That's not a thing. It's just not something that's possible to do. So ultimately, changing exercises too frequently, whether it's just across the week, or changing exercises completely, whether you just kind of, as you say, making it up as you go along, doing one exercise and then coming back the next week, we're doing a different exercise for the same muscle group. That's a horrible approximation of what's happening.
There's basically no time you should be changing exercise except for within the session. Like we've just said, more exercises for single sets as opposed to multi-sets on a single exercise. Yeah. But aside from that, like if you're changing across sessions in the week, obviously you're missing out, yeah? If you're changing across weeks, you're missing out. Even if you're changing across phases, you're still missing out. Unless you need to change that exercise because you've plateaued for ages, it's hurting, you're going backwards, whatever that necessity is.
It's mostly going to be practical reasons rather than physiological reasons,
Yeah.
It's interesting. You made the observation when we were talking about this podcast, you made the observation to me that we had this kind of historical phase where periodization was constructed mainly of people changing rep ranges. And then as people realized that rep range, kind of doesn't really do anything.
They wanted to keep the periodization and they got rid of it.
Yeah, you and I could probably have a whole conversation about the philosophical nature of human kind of thought processes that require them to keep things that don't work. Hegelian dialectics and all that kind of stuff. But, for the purposes of this podcast, people kind of want to keep trappings or, elements of previous kind of practices and just kind of modify them to lose some of the less kind of desirable bits and pieces. So we kind of kept the periodization idea and left behind the rep range changes, and we kind of now people want to change exercises. It's like, let's kind of get rid of that as well. let's kind of just get rid of all of that silly idea and just kind of stick with stuff and do it repeatedly until it actually produces an effect rather than kind of changing it all the time and not expecting anything.
I made the point online a while ago that, in fact, if I were to periodize, I would much prefer periodized rep ranges. with the knowledge that it's not doing anything. But if you want it for novelty, go for gold because you're not losing anything unless you're doing something
this
stupid.
This will be
right?
a theme next week, I'm sure, when you're kind of giving us some tips and suggestions on how
to fool people.
How to fool people into thinking that they're getting that entertainment value. But yeah, so the idea of periodizing exercise is definitely not a cool idea. I mean, okay, fine. If, like I've said before, I really like full body AB. I feel like it's a really nice compromise in many ways. If you don't want to do a billion exercises in a single session, you can kind of split it across 2 workouts and do 3 workouts a week. I really, really like that compromise. But that's as far as I would go because that's the kind of the limit that you've got in terms of atrophy happening within the training week. Yeah. Other than that, I don't think we should be changing exercise between sessions if we want maximum kind of efficacy of the programs that we're writing.
Yeah, I think it's fairly simple. I don't think there's a lot more we're going to say to that, is there?
Not really. But then it ties into the 4th item on my list, which is that I don't see anybody tracking numbers and progressive overload.
Yes.
It's like I go in the gym, I've got my notes app, and straight away I'm like, what did I do last time? What was the number? Okay, here it is. That's what I did last time. This is what I'm going to try and beat this time. And that's it. That's that simple. And I don't see anybody doing that. I mean, there's occasionally you can see some people kind of doing the same thing, but very, very rarely. It's not a theme. And I think if we want to make sure programs are working, we've got to be tracking that progressive overload over time.
Why does it matter? Because there's multiple moving parts to this, and in fact, the reason people think it matters is not one of the things as to why it matters. Right? People assume.
Don't get me started. Oh wow! So there's this whole subculture. There's this whole subculture of people who think that progressive overload is what drives hypertrophy. I mean, honestly, like, is this? Are you trolling me? This is amazing. I mean, seriously. I mean, unbelievable. So the idea that you can the idea that the exercise or the machine or the weight is somehow acting on you rather than the other way around. It's like that's not what's happening here. It's like you can't. And I think maybe I've said this before, but the terminology is unhelpful because overload sounds like...
Overload doesn't make sense, yeah.
No, it doesn't. We're doing something to the muscle. No, the muscle is doing everything.
I mean, it's just progressive loading, isn't it? Like essentially...
It's progressive loading, not overloading, because overload is an excess of something. And you can't have an excess of something because you can only have what the muscle is capable of doing. So it's like the progressive overload is the sign that the muscle has got stronger. That's it. Now, as you kind of hinted at a moment ago, there are a number of other reasons why you might have got stronger. Now some of them are actually helpful for hypertrophy. So if you're relatively sort of new to the exercise, you might be improving coordination, which is not really a big deal, but it will provide a large increase.
Well, that ties back into the exercise selection piece because you change exercises all the time, and all you're doing is coordination.
But you also do need to get through that phase so that you can start to get to the increasing in motor unit recruitment phase. Because if your brain is focusing on the coordination and exercise, it's not really hitting max recruitment. Therefore, you won't be increasing recruitment in the muscle. So you've kind of, even though coordination improvements in coordination-induced improvements in strength are not overtly helpful, they are necessary to get through before you can get to the recruitment point.
Before you get to the helpful bit.
Yeah. So like if somebody is improving strength rapidly and it's a good exercise, it's not a silly kind of kneeling on the floor, waving the cable in the air exercise, as I would say, it's still a good thing. It's like, yeah, fantastic. Let's keep moving forward. And then, you'll start to see the strength gains slowed out even better. That's the point where we're now starting to see recruitment gains and starting to get some really nice kind of high levels of motor unit recruitment that are going to produce a good hypertrophy. So even when it's a coordination improvement that is driving the strength gain, I'm still not unhappy. I'm just I'm just cognizant of that is what it is.
Something I learned from Charles and people who followed Charles and Stefan Guzol was in people who are less experienced at these more complex lifts, say using a multi-joint exercise, like let's say a squat. So what they would teach is you would actually use that squat in later series in these less advanced clients. So you'd say you're doing whatever the split is, and you might have a leg extension as well. Well, you would start with a leg extension and then you would do the squat. And then you have an advanced client and they would often swap it. And we could argue about whether you should or should not swap it. But I like that idea of, okay, if I've got a new lift, which I know has a coordination demand, I'm not thinking of that really as a hypertrophy exercise initially. I'm just going to put it somewhere where it's not going to mess anything else up in the program, let them get coordinated, and then we'll use it later for hypertrophy.
Yeah, I mean, that's a strategy, isn't it? I mean, I probably wouldn't even program the exercise in the first place.
But if you've got a client, you want to get them squatting, I'm not going to,
okay. Well,
you know what I mean? I'm not going to get them
okay.
We're not getting very far with quad development initially. If they're, say we want to learn a front squat or something like that. A lot of people still want to learn some of these more complex exercises, and they're just not going to do a whole lot initially.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're starting to move into athletic domains there, where you're saying, you want to develop a skill. I mean, that's just a whole kind of separate kind of category of conversation. But yeah, absolutely. As a strategy, if somebody has multiple goals and bodybuilding is one goal and learning how to do an exercise is another goal, then yeah, you kind of treat them as separate things, don't you? I mean, and we kind of put them in different places in the workout and try and avoid, interference between the two things. And ultimately, it really depends on the emphasis that the client wants to place on each of those things. How we strategize that. But yeah, I mean, from a bodybuilding point of view, I'm just not going to program that stuff. Doesn't make any sense to me. Something else that I've seen that is probably not, and I'm now getting to the point on my list where
Is this a new point? This is a new point on your list. Just before we move off the progressive overload part. So obviously, I want to quickly play devil's advocate. So if one were not logging their weight, but they're doing the other stuff we've mentioned. So they're repeating the exercises, they're doing it frequently enough, and they might come in and maybe they do the same load as last time, they do a couple kilos less or whatever, right? Well, if you're saying, hey, there's about 5 stimulating repetitions in a set to failure, give or take, and let's say they're not logging the load, and so they've gone a little bit lighter than they could have, they're still getting stimulating repetitions. So why does it actually matter? Like you've identified, it's not the fact that progressive overload is causing the adaptation. So why does it matter if they log or if they don't log?
So what tends to happen as we progress over time and get stronger is that the number of adaptations that are available to us that increase strength get smaller, and their contribution to strength gains also gets smaller. So, for example, like we were just describing, when you first go and start a new exercise, you've got these gigantic improvements in coordination. And so you experience these huge improvements in strength. And every time you go back to the gym, like you're bumping the weight up and everything just feels, kind of very easy. And it's just this wonderful experience. And then that starts to go away and it starts to get trickier. Now, the problem is that our brains get conditioned to think that initial phase is kind of how it's supposed to be forever. That's why you get these people who start lifting for the first time and their bench press goes, kind of up by sort of 10, 20 kilos over the space of a couple of months, and they start imagining that they're going to be benching the world record in 2 years' time. Everybody goes through that phase. So the problem with that, though, is that as the contributions of these adaptations shrinks, people start to not push to increase the weight quite so much. They start to expect that it's just going to be easier. And actually, when you get to the point where you're plateauing on pretty much all of your adaptations apart from hypertrophy, the amount you actually have to work to get that extra rep is quite a lot. And naturally, people just tend not to do that. They just tend to kind of just stick where they are. So what you tend to find is that people who aren't logging will just end up they'll go through these plateau phase. So they'll go through these early phases where they're getting these gigantic strength gains, and they've just been conditioned to expect that's how it should be forever, and they just stop improving. And so ultimately we just get trapped at a particular kind of rep load combination, and without the logbook in front of you telling you that that's what you're doing, people just kind of just sit there. And I think that's what we see in gyms a lot. We see people going through the coordination phase, getting their strength up a notch, and then just stopping there, because they expect that the rest of the journey should be the same, and it's not.
So ultimately, they must be training at a certain repetitions away from failure, like to stop seeing any adaptations occur, or almost any.
Yeah, it's basically that. I mean, if you want to really get granular, what happens is that we get to a certain rep load combination, and then what's going to happen is you do get a little bit of an adaptation with that rep load combination. Let's say you're either at failure or 1 rep in reserve or something like that, and you achieve a little bit of hypertrophy, but you don't achieve any other adaptations that are helping you increase strength, because at this point you kind of got pretty much all of that. And technically now you could do an extra rep, but you don't feel like you can, because it's just still that kind of zone where you're expecting an easier feeling to be accompanying you as you get stronger, but you haven't got any of that other stuff going on in the background as well. You literally just got hypertrophy. So you start to get a little bit further away from failure. And then you get a little bit further away, and then you get a little bit further away. And now you're kind of in that zone where you're kind of always in that sort of 3 or 4 reps in reserve. Combine that with the idea of what we've been talking about, which where you're in a multi-set situation, you probably already were, kind of 2 reps away from the stimulating rep number anyway. You probably just kind of literally now are running on fumes, where you're just putting enough in the tank every single time you go to the gym to tick you over to the next workout, and you're never actually going to make any long-term progressions. So I think I'm describing a scenario where people have used, have gone on the journey. They've done, kind of 3 to 6 months worth of training. They've got all the coordination stuff. They've got a lot of the multi-unit recruitment stuff, all of the other bits and pieces. And now they're just hovering around that zone where the only thing that can really move them forward is hypertrophy. They've been conditioned by the previous 6 months to expect the feeling of getting stronger to be a lot easier than it currently is. And they therefore start to just drift back into the zone where they're, multiple reps in reserve away from failure, which already is probably only 3 stimulating reps, as we were talking about earlier, in the context of many exercises with multiple set protocols.
Yeah, because the reason I'm pushing on this is because I think that that's probably the big part of what's happening here, is essentially this motivation aspect. Because as we've just said, okay, if you do a single set, you're probably going to get 1, 2, at least repetitions more than what you would normally. So maybe we're arguing, hey, there might be, and we did that podcast a few weeks ago where we talked about they were doing 3 to 5 repetitions and saw similar gains, right? So maybe we're now saying there could be 3 or 4 stimulating repetitions for some people in a set, yeah? And so
in multi-set protocols.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so now if there's, say, only 3 maximally stimulating repetitions and they've allowed themselves to drift, 2 repetitions shy of failure, well, we're getting, like you've identified, enough to hold over those gains, but not really enough to see anything new occur. Yes. So when you have the logbook, it keeps you honest. It keeps you realizing, okay, this is my target. This is motivating me. It's giving me a target, a goal. I think that that's where most of the value is.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's pushing people to be honest with themselves about where they currently are, and the fact that if they don't, and I think this is an important point, which is that if we don't sort of add reps onto our current kind of rep load combination, we aren't going to that's telling us we're not adding any more.
We're not seeing, yeah.
Just to be clear, people are still really confused about this, because they go, every time I raise this issue, they're like, oh, well, no, strength and size are not the same thing. No, they're not the same thing. That's correct. But you cannot add muscle tissue but not get stronger. Okay, so there's no scenario in which you can be doing the same rep load combination now and in 6 months' time and have added muscle mass in that period of time. It is not possible. If you've increased, but equally you could have got stronger and not added muscle mass. So the other way around is fine. I mean, that's the bit that people seem to like. Their brains seem to explode when I kind of raise this point. And that's every single person, no matter how smart they are and how well read they are and how tightly constructed their arguments are. Every single person is using reverse causality on this argument to make their point. Every person is doing that. They're all going, look, I can get stronger without getting bigger, therefore you're wrong. I'm like, no, I'm accepting your argument that way around. I'm not accepting your argument the other way around. You can't add muscle mass and not get stronger. That's not possible.
I have a feeling I'm going to see videos in TikTok this week being like, look how stupid Chris is. Hang on, this is probably where it's going to go. I think they're going to say you can get bigger without getting stronger. It's called sarcoplasmic hypertrophy.
So sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is not an adaptation. It's a phase that muscle fibers go through as they're progressing from one state to another. and that's actually not that controversial. I mean, you'll find most hypertrophy researchers, kind of more or less in that zone, I think. So yeah, I mean, that's only really slightly more long. If you want to kind of look at time periods, like muscle swelling is like maybe a week-long phenomenon at most. Sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is maybe a couple of weeks phenomenon before you phase back out of it. Interestingly, if you look at the cross-sectional studies that measure the difference in myofibrillar density between, because ultimately sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is basically just saying myofibrillar density is going down. That's all it's saying. So if you kind of look at cross-sectional studies, what you'll find is that the myofibrillar density of people who've been training for a longer period of time, say 4 years, is higher than the people who've been only training for a few months. So it does look like over time we gradually move towards a slightly more dense arrangement of myofibrils, which is the opposite of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. So in the context of what we're describing here, which is, people who've been training 6 months to a year or 2 years or whatever, and we're describing how progressive overload keeps us adding more muscle mass, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is just not even on the table as a thing. It's not a conversation it's just not relevant. It's a thing that happens to people, in contexts that are much shorter in duration and probably less well-trained.
Cool. Okay. Well, hopefully if you get stitched, they add that part of the conversation in as well.
We could have an entire conversation about why I don't care. I mean, ultimately, 99.9% of social media that discusses the issues that I'm talking about is doing so in order to accrue social credibility and power. They're not doing it because they're trying to, educate. They're not doing it because they're interested in finding an answer. And so they're not having a conversation with me. And people get like, they get upset that I don't want to talk to them. I'm like, I don't want to talk to you because you're not doing the same thing as me. I'm trying to figure out how this stuff works. You're trying to accrue social power. That's just not the same thing. It's like, and I'm not going to play your game because I'm not here to do that. So anyway, there you go.
What's next on your list?
My next thing on my list is actually something that you pointed out when we were having this conversation, because this is actually now entering the zone of things that are not high on my list of things that I see being problematic. And the reason, and again, this is something we talked about, the reason I'm not seeing this on my list of something that's problematic is because it actually gets negated by another error earlier on my list. So
because you're seeing more of that first error, you're seeing less of this one.
Less of this error, yeah. So this error is where people do exercise or training variable combinations that are very muscle damaging. So essentially, maybe they're doing a lot of focus on eccentrics. Maybe they're doing a lot of intensification type stuff where they train to failure and then do drop sets or lengthen partials or whatever. Essentially, or they're doing tons and tons of sets to failure, high volume. This is really being negated by the cardiovascular sensations error.
Yep.
Because if you have high level of cardiovascular sensation in the actual exercise you're doing, you can't really get into this territory where you're hitting high levels of motor unit recruitment with sort of high volumes, and therefore produce a lot of muscle damaging effects. So that's why this isn't really on my list, but it absolutely could be on my list if somebody was approaching things in a different way. I'm not seeing it right now.
It's very interesting how one mistake can actually protect you from another mistake. You need something we've touched on a little bit with some of the golden era plans, where there was this high, density, low rest periods between sets, high repetitions, high cardiovascular demand. And we look at it, we're like, how are they doing so much volume? Well, they're doing so much volume because it's not muscle damaging, because it's low quality volume, essentially. So it's interesting that there's sometimes a protective effect of some of these errors. Or, like we talked about last week, maybe they were being done intentionally or unconsciously or subconsciously intentionally in a way to protect from injuries or whatever it might have been. But either way, there's a potential upside to one of these downsides. Now, this was a point I brought up because I see this a lot with either you have new people in the gym, especially like younger guys, and there's sort of like a little bit of an ego, alpha male kind of sort of mentality or approach going on, and they try to outwork the people that they're training with, and they do things like run the rack with the dumbbells, and they do 400 sets of dumbbell curls or just excessive amounts of volume, or The other sort of flip side here is you get people who've taken a couple weeks off, a month off, whatever, in December, they've been busy. And then they get back into the gym and they kind of think, well, yeah, I kind of need to make up for all this time I lost. And they've lost some of that protective effect that they had in place from, they had not trained now for a month. And so repeated bout effect essentially has been lost. And then suddenly they jump in with high volumes or the volume they had previously been doing. And that's high enough that they now cause more muscle damage initially than they would have previously been causing when they were more, trained. So that's something that I think people need to, I know everyone wants to see results yesterday, but for the first week, maybe just kind of chill out a little bit, drop the volume a little bit, maybe keep your repertoire in reserve. Don't try to kill yourself with damaging exercise and high volumes, and just kind of, ease your way back into it.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, that's always the right answer. I mean, it's a marathon, not a sprint. So that's all I've really got to say on that one. I mean, I as I say, it's definitely an error, but I don't actually see it that much at the moment. And in fact, the next on my list is also pretty much the same, which is that technically it would be an error for people to, kind of use bro splits or, even really upper lower. I'm not a fan of. But again, because of the cardiovascular sensations chasing, I'm tending to see a lot of personal trainers just throwing their clients through full body routines because they're trying to make them as out of breath as possible. And that's the easiest way of doing that. And so I don't tend to see that error. I think that error is much more in our niche kind of bodybuilding sort of a part of the fitness industry rather than the kind of client facing part, which is, 90% of the industry really. So, it is, again, something we've talked about 100 million times, but it's just not something that I'm seeing when I go to the gym.
I see that less amongst personal trainers. I certainly think that PTs nowadays are using more full body or upper lower.
Yeah.
I'd say upper lower is probably a little bit more popular, but either way, it'll be one of these splits. Where I see this mistake being made is by general population individuals who are not using a coach, not using a PT, and either just Googling a workout routine, or they've got a mate who's been going to the gym and they write them a routine or whatever. And in a lot of the work I do with clients and consultations that I do, I see this not like you'd think, okay, maybe enhanced lifters are doing it. We all know that there's this carryover from what we were seeing in the golden era, and okay, maybe that's a mistake that's been grandfathered in. No, I'm not just seeing it with that type of client. I'm seeing this with your middle-aged female client who's new to the gym. I'll do a consult with them. Hey, what's your exercise routine look like? And it's a bro split. I'm like, Michelle, are you sure you really need an arms day? Like, I don't know that that's achieving what you think it's achieving. So I think maybe it's not a thing over there, but over here, it's certainly an issue. So like you said, is there much more we need to say to it? Probably not. I'm sure everyone who's listening to us has heard us say this a million times, but like, what is a bro split doing correctly? It's getting you in the gym. Like, I can't think of really anything else it's doing. There's nothing it's doing well. There's only things that it's doing neutrally or poorly. God, I'm trying to rack my brain for anything it's doing even remotely well, and it's not. So yeah, not a good option for anyone. I can't think of anyone that it's a good option for. And there's a lot of, this is what we see. And again, this is a philosophical statement, I suppose, but people have a tendency to do something which is nonsensical and then retrospectively apply sense to it and be like, well, this is why I do a bro split. And somehow they try to justify how it makes sense. And
that was the refrain that we had on the Chris and Paul show for like 2 years. His name is Robert Paulson. It's the Fight Club scene where basically they're kind of looking at each other, trying to figure out how to overcome this kind of discrepancy between two sources, two pieces of information which are mutually contradictory, and then they kind of like they battle their way through live on screen to produce the synthesis of this problem, and that's what you're describing. I mean, it's
exactly.
True.
Yes, and so I see people justifying why to do a pro split all the time. And it's like, just don't do it. Just don't retrospectively justify your actions. Like, use the information to construct what you're going to do, not to explain what you did do. But I hear people talking about, if I'm doing a bro split, like frequency is high because muscles are being trained isometrically when I'm doing
Again,
another
the
exercise.
whole muscles being trained. I mean, hitting muscles, training muscles, whatever vocabulary we use is absolutely invalid. The only thing that happens is muscle fibers or motor units are getting recruited or activated. There's no scenario in which you can kind of go, oh, this exercise and that exercise, they both train the same muscle. I'm like, that's not a statement that means anything. Yep. You can't train a muscle. That's not how this works. So that idea has done so much damage to the understanding of how this stuff works.
Yeah, I mean, I guess essentially if you just start with hypertrophy is muscle fiber specific and there's diminishing returns of gains in terms of additional sets, then take those two principles and then
You'll arrive at a silver era routine. You will.
You will, and you'll realize, hey, this bro split makes no sense.
Yeah, and you realize that all the bro split stuff is just because steroids arrived in the 1960s.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And a point I've been making online at the moment, and I'm convinced of this, obviously it's speculation, but I think a lot of what we see in the way the plans have evolved since steroids were introduced is probably a way or are ways to manage some of the downsides of steroid use. And so then what we see is naturals who are following steroid-inspired plans, but they don't have the same limitations. And so you're following a plan that was never made for you. You're following a plan that hopefully was designed to meet the limitations of a particular population, of which you are not. I mean, you may be. If you're on a hands lift, okay, we can have that conversation.
I'm still not really clear how that works either, because and that's me saying that I'm interested in how to make this make sense, because at the moment I can understand the risks that we talked about last week in the episode about anabolic steroids and the injury risks associated with connective tissue. There's definitely something going on there that caused people to, maybe caused people to move away from the silver era type routines towards something else, but it doesn't really line up perfectly with me yet. I can't quite see how volumes increased. That doesn't make sense to me. I can understand why frequencies might have gone down, sure. But I still can't quite understand why, and I can understand why intensification techniques came in and rest periods got shorter and all that kind of thing. I mean, all of that makes sense, where you're trying to increase fatigue to reduce the strain on the tendon. Fine. But I still can't quite see how we ended up doing crazy workout volumes at the same time. To me, it would have made more sense for them to, unless you kind of say, well, that's the performative bit.
I mean, obviously this is a whole, another conversation we could have, but I think what's interesting if you look at that is there's obviously bodybuilders we can identify who were doing single sets or 2 sets, and there's bodybuilders who are doing 6 sets, 10 sets, and their frequency, exercise selection, all that looks the same. So it's like, okay, what's the thing here that's causing the outcome to be?
Yeah, exactly. Sure. So the reduced frequency, fine, and they try and use fatigue to minimize kind of the tendon sort of damage, fine, but some people are doing high volumes, some people are doing low volumes, and it just doesn't seem to make any difference. Fine, okay. No, I mean, I get my head around that, but ultimately, as I say, there's definitely that performative aspect where people have to keep sort of selling the fact that they have this knowledge that is what's driving the kind of success rather than the steroid itself. And I think that's kind of muddying the waters, because that definitely exists.
And there's no surprise when you look at some of these magazines at that time. These people were being described as Superman. This person is a Superman. They're able to do this many sets. The average man cannot do that many
exactly.
sets.
So it's totally performative. So it's part of the kind of the mythology that grows up around that area. So you kind of, although we like to reduce stuff back down to single reasons for things, sometimes when you, especially in sociological situations like this is, you kind of got to maybe accept that there's a muddier answer to the kind of question, which may be what we're stuck with.
So, was there anything else on your list, or was that?
I have a bonus item on the list, which is related to what we talked about last time, which is injury risk. So essentially, I don't see this as being a huge deal. I think a lot of the personal trainers, if not all the personal trainers that I see, are cognizant of injury risk, and I do think
it's because they want a paying
generally
client. They don't want an
look
injured
after their clients. So I don't think, and again, with the cardiovascular stuff, generally speaking, that we're keeping, kind of, muscle damage relatively low.
Yeah.
People out of breath all the time. They're not going to be able to do tons and tons and tons of reps of stuff. But equally, I think there just are a couple of observations to be made.
Yes.
Firstly, if we are doing exercises that have huge amounts of variation possible, so like if the exercise is not a fixed bar path, if the exercise is not kind of constrained, then there is potential for, kind of movements in directions that you weren't expecting, to compensations that you weren't expecting. And that does kind of potentially lead to the possibility of an injury occurring. So that's a minor thing, but it's just something that I am aware of. Similarly, if you are doing really, really high numbers of repetitions, then you kind of are drifting, especially with somebody who hasn't got previous strength training experience, then you are drifting into territory where the tendon is going to be bouncing around quite a lot. So light load does allow the tendon to strain and recoil. A heavier load doesn't allow it to do that. Strain and recoil is what damages the tendon, not the force that's applied through it. I keep saying this, people just keep sort of ignoring me, and it's absolutely how tendon damage happens. So tendon damage is a strain and recoil phenomenon. Lighter loads with high repetitions are going to allow the tendon to strain and recoil many, many times. That is basically going to create, a damaging effect, which could lead to a problem in the future.
Is that more of an issue with fast tempos?
I'm not sure, actually. I think it's a really difficult one to answer. I would say probably yes, but again, I wouldn't want people to run around with the idea that means that if they do their light load sets with slow tempo, they're immune to this problem, because I don't think that's true. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, I wouldn't do high rep kind of work, especially high volume, high rep work, with somebody who hasn't already got a stiff tendon. Ultimately, just kind of as a very, very brief rabbit hole, this is what calisthenics athletes run into when they start doing tons and tons and tons of reps of pull-ups or whatever other skill they're trying to improve on. They're like, and for some reason their coach tells them they need to do high rep pull-ups because they think that's good for the connective tissue, which is actually the opposite. It's bad. If they instead did like heavy sort of weighted pull-ups in small volumes, they would actually not have those issues, because what's happening is the tendon gets stiffer from the heavy load and then is able to resist being lengthened in other scenarios. So for somebody who's done a bunch of heavy strength training, they then go and do some high rep work because they want to, or they fancy a change, or whatever, it doesn't really matter. They're not going to have the same issues because the tendon is already stiff. If you kind of take somebody who's never done any of that and you start throwing high rep work at them, then I think that risk is increasing. Now, as I say, you can minimize that effect with the cardiovascular sensations, because the cardiovascular sensations stop people doing as many reps as they would do if they weren't kind of fresh. But it does kind of start to mitigate that problem. But again, something to be aware of in that particular context. And then equally, again, for people who don't have sort of strength training adaptations like costomer addition and sarcomatogenesis, I think, again, potentially there is a muscle strain injury risk issue if you start throwing them too much into a muscle damaging routine and then kind of, doing that again and again and again and again. Again, not something I'm seeing people doing. I don't see that is on the radar right now, but potentially if you did, like you were saying, perhaps people who've maybe had a month or so off because of busy period of time, they then come back and they start throwing themselves into make up for lost time, and they start doing really muscle damaging stuff, and they keep doing that really muscle damaging stuff week on week on week, because that's ultimately what creates muscle strain injury. People don't realize, people love to do this armchair quarterback thing where they look at exactly what somebody was doing at the point where the muscle kind of strained, and they're all kind of analyzing it and drawing lines on a graph going, oh, this is what they were doing and that's why it went wrong. And like, no, it was literally what they did for the month prior to that point that was causing the problem, because strain injury is literally just a progressive effect of tiny strain accumulation. So again, not seeing that happening at the moment, but like as a bonus thing we can kind of mention.
Now, from an injury perspective or standpoint, argument I still see being made is that the way to prevent this, or at least mitigate against it, is simply just do multiple warm-up sets. And the best warm-up is simply to do the exercise that you're going to do for the working set. And so you do your 3 sets of 10 warm-up repetition sets, and then that's going to somehow magically protect you from getting injured. And that's simply not doing what people think it's doing, is it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's the Luke Skywalker meme. Everything in that sentence is wrong. I mean, everything in that sentence is wrong. So, yeah, basically the best, as you said, the best way to mitigate muscle strain injuries, for example, is not to do warm-up. So that's not the best way to do it. It is a way of helping, but it is not going to, well, even that's arguable, actually. The best way to do it is to not create the fatigue accumulation in the first place. In fact, that's pretty much the only way.
It's the only way you're going to do it, yeah.
Because ultimately, even if you were doing the most perfect warm-up in the world every single time, if you were still accumulating minor strain injury from session to session by doing really muscle-damaging stuff and not recovering from it, then all that would happen is your muscle strain injury would happen, further down the line instead of earlier. That's all that would happen. You would just delay it a few weeks.
Just buying yourself a little bit of time.
Buying yourself another couple of weeks. So it's not actually going to save you from... So the ultimate thing that does cause those strain injuries is the accumulation of very, very tiny strains inside single muscle fibers that eventually kind of accumulate to the point where the entire kind of section of muscle fails. If we talk about what warm-ups are doing, if you do a temperature increase in the muscle by either putting it in a warm bath of water or doing aerobic exercise for 15 to 20 minutes prior to a strength training session, then what will happen is that the muscle fibers will be better able to resist the strain injuries from occurring, whether that's on a single fiber level or across the whole muscle level. It's irrelevant in the scenario which you are kind of putting them in. So it's like you give them a bit of a defensive strategy for it. But again, all that will happen is it will just increase the amount of fatigue accumulation that you need before you're going to cause a failure to occur. So all it will do is buy you a couple of weeks. Strength training sets aren't achieving that anyway. So if somebody does say 3 or 4 strength training sets as a warm-up prior to their main set, that is not achieving a muscle temperature increase, because it's just nowhere near enough exercise to be able to do that. You need 15 to 20 minutes of aerobic exercise or sit in a warm bath of water.
Yeah, not 30, 60 seconds of your warm-up set.
Not a couple of, especially given that most of us, when we're doing warm-up sets, we're probably not doing high reps anyway, because we want to try and avoid the fatigue that is associated with those. So really, I don't know where this idea has come from that you can do a couple of warm-up sets and that somehow reduces muscle strain injury risk. It doesn't. That's not what it's doing. It's getting you comfortable with the weight and making sure, especially like at my age, I want to make sure that nothing is going to break when I do a set, because I could have aged in the last. Sometimes when I look at what happens on social media, I feel like I've aged years in this. I'm like, just keep coming back to this thing about, I forget whether it's a genuine Einstein quote or whether it's one of those just that got attributed to him, where he says, about things that are infinite, and there's only 2 things that are infinite, the universe and human stupidity. I don't know what the exact quote is, but broadly speaking, that's kind of, you just see these insane things being said about all kinds of stuff. And, but yeah, strength training sets are not creating a temperature increase. They're not doing that. If somebody has a study that shows that they do that, please, kind of wave it around and, triumphantly tell me that I'm wrong. But I don't think such a study exists. And it doesn't make sense.
Studies on warm-up sets are pretty weak.
Yeah, there's pretty much nothing out there. And, if somebody wants to go, but it improves performance, I'm like, fine, there's a potential post-activation potentiation effect of doing a short burst of high recruitment activity prior to doing another, we call it conditioning contraction, prior to doing a strength training set. That's not the same thing.
Yeah, that's not preventing you from getting injured and may not be doing much from a hypertrophy standpoint either. We don't know.
But it's not the muscle temperature thing. That's the important bit. It's a phosphorylation of myosin regulatory light chains. It's a separate kind of phenomenon entirely. When we're talking about the evidence base that exists for reducing muscle strain injury, there is some really nice data showing that if you warm up a muscle temperature-wise, it does reduce the risk of injuries. That's absolutely 100% true. But strength training sets are not doing that.
I genuinely think this is where a lot of the confusion comes in, because the studies that talk about that.
It's word thinkers. It's people that go, I see the word warm up on the page, and that must mean the same thing that says warm up elsewhere.
Precisely.
Word thinkers. Scott Adams has done this. He's done a beautiful analysis of word thinkers, which is, I mean, there's probably a very rude way of describing it, but basically he's like, people who are trapped by this kind of use of words. They think that words always mean the same thing in every single context. And it's like, that's not how language works. That's not how concepts work. We use words to describe concepts. You have to be aware that the map is not the territory. You've got to be aware that sometimes when we're using the words as a map, that is not perfectly describing the underlying physiological reality. You've got to go and just check that you are in fact describing the same thing. And warm-up set is not the same thing as a muscle warming up period of exercise. And so, but the problem is, again, somebody who's just not focused on being precise and telling, things how they are, who's just focusing on accruing, followers and being popular, can just kind of rely on the fact that a lot of human beings are word thinkers, and they just get trapped by this kind of, that's that word there in that context, that means the same thing as that word in this other context. Yeah. And they can rely on the fact that people don't question that, and then suddenly they're, kind of blowing up their social media account, making a point that's completely invalid. That's the world we live in. So.
Social media. So there you have it. That is our list of pitfalls to avoid next week, or for all time. Whenever you're in the gym, avoid these pitfalls. That was getting your list, wasn't it? But we didn't miss anything.
That is my list, absolutely. Yeah, that's all of those things, including the bonus one at the end, which I don't really think, as I say, to be fair to personal trainers, I don't think they do run that risk. It's just something that is a little aggravating when people talk about it online.
Yeah. Yeah, again, personal trainers don't have the time to do some of these, to make some of these mistakes. Their mistakes are limited, usually by time availability. So
and the desires of their clients to be, kind of, to feel
doing something that they think is effective, and warm-up sets don't feel effective
which
usually.
Is kind of what we'll tackle, I think, next week. I'm excited about that one, because I think, as I said before, when we were talking about this as a series of 2 podcasts, I think the way that you've written your programs, the way you design your programs, is definitely successful on that front. You've kind of cracked the code in terms of delivering your clients things that they are going to enjoy at the same time and feel valuable at the same time as actually being valuable. And that's really cool.
How to manipulate the client into seeing results.
I was phrasing it in a nice way.
The topic of next week. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We will see you, or you will hear us more accurately, in the new year. So we do hope you'll join us again for another year, and I hope or wish everyone a happy new year.